When a military leader stands before his nation and explicitly names the ghosts of dead presidents to explain why he won't back down, you have to ask yourself, what kind of pressure is being applied behind closed doors that he feels compelled to invoke the murdered remains of his predecessors? Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, recently made a speech that wasn't about what he said. It was about what he was warning against, and the chilling reference to the fates of Sankara and Muammar Gaddafi suggests that someone somewhere is playing a very dangerous game of political chess with his life hanging in the balance. This is a story about power, pressure, and the invisible forces that shape nations. And it all comes down to a single question. Can a leader hold his ground when the world's pressure is designed not just to defeat him politically, but to psychologically break him? Let's start with the basics. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in West Africa, with a population of over 20 million people, has become the unlikely flashpoint of a larger geopolitical struggle that most people in the Western world have never heard about. But the decisions made in Ouagadougou, the capital, could reshape the entire power dynamic of the Sahel region and determine whether Africa's newest generation of leaders can chart their own course, or whether they'll be forced to bend to the will of external powers who have profited from their influence for decades. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't come to power through a traditional election. He came to power through a military coup, taking control in September 2023 in what many observers saw as part of a larger wave of military takeovers sweeping across West Africa. But Traoré is different from your typical strongman narrative. He came with a vision, a message, and a promise. Burkina Faso would reclaim its sovereignty, rebuild its security, and chart a path toward what he calls second independence, a complete break from the colonial and neo-colonial patterns that have defined the nation's existence since the days of Sankara. Now, here's where things get interesting. Sankara was Burkina Faso's president in the 1980s, a revolutionary leader who dared to stand up to France and reimagine what a West African nation could be. He was widely loved, fiercely independent, and unapologetically ambitious about his vision for continental African unity and self-determination. In 1987, Sankara was assassinated in a coup. To this day, the exact circumstances remain murky, though France's involvement is heavily suspected by those who study the region. Sankara's legacy became one of caution. Challenge the old order too directly, and you might not live to see your vision realized. Fast forward to Libya. Muammar Gaddafi spent over 4 decades in power, from 1969 until 2011, when he was overthrown during the Libyan civil war. But here's the critical detail that Traoré seems to be invoking. Gaddafi's fall came after intense pressure from NATO forces, particularly France and the United States, who supported the insurgency. Gaddafi died not of old age or natural causes, but in a violent and chaotic manner during the conflict. His death wasn't just political, it was personal, humiliating, and cautionary. By invoking both Sankara and Gaddafi in his recent address, Traoré is doing something profoundly significant. He's not just referencing past leaders. He's signaling that he understands a template. He understands how external powers have removed leaders who became too independent, too challenging to the established order. And he's making a public declaration. I see what you're doing, and I will not be intimidated by it. But what exactly is being done to him? This is where the narrative becomes more complex, because Traoré doesn't explicitly name his antagonists in the way Western media might demand. He speaks of external forces and foreign powers attempting to create psychological pressure, to intimidate him through indirect threats. The viral headlines and media framing have pointed fingers at specific actors, French President Emmanuel Macron and regional powers. But Traoré himself keeps it broader, more universal. In some ways, that universality is more powerful. It suggests a system, not just individual rivalries. Here's what we know about the pressure being applied to Traoré's Burkina Faso. France has maintained a complicated relationship with its former colonies in West Africa. For decades, France exercised enormous economic and military influence over these nations, controlling their currency systems, maintaining military bases, and ensuring that French interests remained paramount. This system of neo-colonialism allowed France to maintain relevance and power without the direct administrative burden of traditional colonization. But Traoré represents a threat to this carefully constructed arrangement. When Traoré took power, one of his first moves was to question France's military presence in the country. France had maintained military operations in Burkina Faso as part of its broader counter-terrorism mission across the Sahel region. But from Traoré's perspective, and from the perspective of a growing number of African leaders, this French military presence was less about fighting terrorism and more about maintaining control. It was about ensuring that Burkina Faso remained within the French sphere of influence, unable to make truly independent decisions. This created a direct conflict. Traoré began moving closer to other international actors, particularly Russia, whose paramilitary and military advisory groups offered an alternative to French military support without the historical baggage of colonialism. This pivot away from France and toward Russia wasn't just a military calculation. It was a symbolic act of defiance, a signal that Burkina Faso was choosing independence, choosing to diversify its partnerships, choosing to be truly sovereign. But that's not the full story, because the pressure Traoré speaks of isn't merely institutional or diplomatic. Psychological warfare has become a sophisticated tool in modern geopolitics. When you control international media narratives, financial systems, and diplomatic channels, you can create a suffocating environment around a leader without ever having to explicitly threaten them. You can suggest, insinuate, and create doubt. You can isolate them on the international stage. You can question their legitimacy. You can freeze their assets. You can support internal opposition. And perhaps most chillingly, you can remind them, through the historical record, through the ghosts of predecessors, what happens to leaders who become too much of a problem. The invoking of Sankara and Gaddafi in Traoré's speech is precisely this kind of psychological signal. He's saying, I see the pattern. I understand the implied threat, and I'm telling my nation and the world that I will not be broken by it. This is the psychology of defiance in the face of overwhelming pressure. What happened next shows just how serious this struggle has become. Traoré's government doubled down on its vision for Burkina Faso's transformation. His administration focused intensely on national security, arguing that the primary threat to Burkina Faso's stability wasn't external forces like France, but rather the militant insurgencies that had plagued the country for years. By positioning security and sovereignty as intertwined goals, Traoré created a narrative where accepting foreign intervention was portrayed as accepting weakness and vulnerability. This narrative resonated powerfully with Burkinabe citizens, particularly younger generations who have grown up in the shadow of colonial and neo-colonial influence. For many, Traoré represented something genuinely new, a leader who wasn't apologizing for being African, who wasn't deferring to Paris or Washington, who was willing to stand up and say that Burkina Faso's problems would be solved by Burkinabes, not by foreign military bases or foreign economic pressure. But here's where things get complicated. The psychological pressure that Traoré speaks of doesn't just come from Paris. It comes from a much broader ecosystem. International financial institutions can impose conditions on loans. Western allies can impose sanctions. Neighboring countries that are still aligned with Western powers can apply pressure at the regional level. Civil society organizations, some of which are funded by Western foundations, can challenge the government's legitimacy. And the international media can portray instability and insecurity where there might be determination and transformation. Traoré's speech becomes significant precisely because he's trying to break through this ecosystem of pressure. He's not just addressing other world leaders. He's addressing his own nation, trying to explain that the external pressure they might feel isn't random or coincidental. It's targeted. It's designed to create doubt, fear, and ultimately, capitulation. By naming the psychological warfare, he's trying to inoculate his people against it, to help them understand that if things get harder, if international criticism increases, if economic pressure mounts, it's because they're moving in a direction that threatens the established order. The reference to second independence is crucial here. First independence, for most African nations, simply meant the formal end of colonial administration and the nominal transfer of power to local leadership. But true independence, economic independence, military independence, the ability to make decisions without external interference, that's a different matter entirely. Traore is arguing that Burkina Faso has never truly been independent, and that achieving that independence is a generational struggle, not something that can be accomplished in one term or one presidency. This framing does something important. It shifts the timeline. It suggests that even if pressures mount, even if things become difficult, the mission is bigger than any single moment or crisis. It's a long-term commitment to transformation. And it explains why Traore would invoke the martyred figures of Sankara and Gaddafi, because he's positioning himself as part of a historical lineage of leaders who dared to resist, who dared to imagine something different, even when the cost was catastrophic. But that's also where the tragedy of his position becomes apparent, because implicit in his invocation of these figures is the acknowledgement that challenging the established order can be fatal. He's not pretending that defiance is costless. He's acknowledging the danger while insisting that the alternative, surrender, capitulation, accepting neo-colonial arrangements, is worse. This is the calculation of a leader who has decided that his mission is worth the risk. What makes this moment particularly significant is that Traore is not alone. Across West Africa, a new generation of military leaders in Mali, in Guinea, in Niger, is moving in similar directions. They're questioning French military presence. They're diversifying partnerships. They're prioritizing national security and sovereignty over international integration. They're speaking a language of resistance and dignity that resonates with their populations. What we're witnessing is potentially the beginning of a significant shift in the geopolitical balance of the Sahel region. But this shift is also creating profound instability, at least in the short term. When leaders choose to distance themselves from established international arrangements, the transition period is chaotic and dangerous. Security situations can worsen. Economic conditions can deteriorate. And in that chaos, the pressure mounts. The international pressure increases. The narrative becomes, you see, these leaders can't deliver. Look at the instability. Look at the insecurity. This was a mistake. Come back to the international order. Accept the presence of French forces. Accept the constraints of international institutions. This is precisely the pressure that Traore seems to be addressing. He's acknowledging that yes, there will be difficult periods. Yes, the external pressure will intensify. But none of that proves that the mission is wrong. It just proves that forces with vested interests in maintaining the status quo are fighting back. The broader geopolitical context makes this even more significant. The United States and Europe are increasingly concerned about Russian and Chinese influence in Africa. Russia has successfully positioned itself as an alternative to Western power structures, offering military support without the historical baggage of colonialism and without requiring the kind of democratic and institutional reforms that Western powers often insist upon. For a leader like Traore, this offers genuine strategic options in a way that wasn't available to previous African leaders. China, similarly, has positioned itself as a development partner willing to invest in African infrastructure without imposing governance conditions. This has created a multipolar moment in African geopolitics, where leaders have choices, where they're not forced to accept the dominance of any single power. Traore's movement toward Russia and away from France should be understood in this context. It's not primarily about loving Russia or hating France on a personal level. It's about accessing strategic autonomy. But strategic autonomy, in a world of powerful competing interests, always comes with a price. And Traore seems to be calculating that price carefully, that he understands what he's risking, but that the long-term vision of true independence makes the risk worth taking. Here's where the analysis becomes truly complex. The pressure that Traore speaks of, the psychological intimidation, the implied threats, the invoking of the fates of Sankara and Gaddafi, these are real. But they're also, in some sense, the price of ambition. Every leader who has ever challenged the established order has faced pressure. The question is whether they're willing to endure it, whether their vision is strong enough to sustain them through the difficult periods, whether they have the support of their people. Traore seems to believe that he does. His popularity in Burkina Faso appears genuine, at least among significant segments of the population. People see in him a leader who is willing to stand up, who is willing to fight, who is not intimidated by the world's most powerful actors. This perception of strength and defiance is itself a form of power, and it's something that Traore is weaponizing through speeches like the one we're discussing. But there's also a cautionary tale here, because history suggests that leaders who become too much of a problem, who resist too effectively, who threaten the interests of powerful external actors too directly, they often don't last. The pattern that Traore is invoking isn't just a pattern of threat and intimidation. It's a pattern of actual removal, actual death. Sankara was assassinated. Gaddafi was killed. These weren't metaphorical consequences. They were real, brutal, violent endings. So when Traore stands before his nation and invokes these figures while declaring that he will not be intimidated, he's not just making a political statement. He's making an existential statement. He's saying that his mission, his vision for Burkina Faso's transformation, is worth the risk of dying for. He's asking his people to understand that what they're undertaking is not a normal political transition. It's a revolutionary transformation that will be resisted with all the tools available to those who benefit from the status quo. What happened next in the months following his speech reveals whether this commitment was genuine or rhetorical. Traore's government continued to move forward with its security agenda, with its cultural and nationalist initiatives, with its efforts to build a Burkinabe identity that was truly independent and self-referential. But the external pressure also continued, manifesting in different forms: diplomatic criticism, economic constraints, regional instability that could be attributed to his government's policies. The genius of Traore's speech is that he was attempting to preemptively frame all of this pressure as evidence of external intimidation rather than evidence of policy failure or instability. In other words, if things get worse, his narrative allows him to attribute that to external pressure rather than to mistakes or limitations. This is a powerful rhetorical move, and it's one that seems to have resonated with his base. But it's also a strategy with significant risks. Because if things do deteriorate significantly, if the security situation doesn't improve, if economic conditions worsen, then the narrative of external pressure can only sustain the government for so long before people demand results in action. And if results don't materialize, if the promised transformation doesn't begin to manifest in concrete ways, then even the most loyal supporters will begin to question whether the mission was worth the cost. This is the fundamental drama at the heart of Traore's position. He's not just fighting external forces. He's racing against time, against the deteriorating conditions that might undermine his authority before his vision can be realized. He needs to deliver something tangible: improvements in security, economic growth, the actual realization of second independence, fast enough that the population's faith in his mission survives the inevitable difficult transition period. The invocation of Sankara and Gaddafi was also, in some sense, a plea for understanding. He was saying, I know the risks, I know what happened to them, and I'm proceeding anyway, which means I'm deadly serious about what I'm trying to accomplish. This kind of statement can be profoundly moving to a population that feels historically victimized by external powers. It says, your leader is willing to die for this vision. He's not going to abandon it at the first sign of pressure. But it also puts enormous pressure on Traore himself. Because once you've invoked the murdered martyrs, once you've acknowledged the risks, once you've declared your willingness to resist external pressure, you can't back down. You can't compromise. You can't accept the status quo. Because if you do, you haven't just failed politically. You've failed morally and historically. You've become the leader who had the chance to transform his nation and decided it wasn't worth the risk. This is the cruel bind that revolutionary leaders often find themselves in. Their boldness, their refusal to compromise, their clear-eyed acknowledgement of the stakes. These things win them popular support and historical significance. But they also limit their options. They trap them in a trajectory that they might not be able to deviate from without losing everything they built. So what does the future look like for Burkina Faso and Captain Ibrahim Traoré? The honest answer is that no one knows. The pressures he speaks of are real, the stakes are genuine, and the outcome is genuinely uncertain. He could succeed in transforming Burkina Faso into a more truly independent nation, with stronger security, genuine sovereignty, and a different relationship to international power structures. Or he could fail, facing increased pressure, deteriorating conditions, and ultimately, removal or worse. What's certain is that his speech, his explicit acknowledgement of external pressure, his invocation of martyred predecessors, his defiant commitment to second independence, reveals something profound about the contemporary moment in African politics. It reveals that the struggle between external pressure and internal sovereignty is not over, not settled, and very much alive. It reveals that leaders in places like Burkina Faso are making conscious, deliberate choices about which direction their nations will move, even when those choices come with significant costs. And it raises a haunting question that extends far beyond Burkina Faso. In a world where power is concentrated in the hands of established global actors, where pressure can be applied through economics, diplomacy, and military force, can any leader truly resist? Can any nation truly achieve genuine independence? Or are the Traores of the world simply discovering, through bitter experience, that the old order has too many tools, too much leverage, too much patience to be truly challenged? That question will define not just Traore's future, but the future of Africa itself in the coming